The church bells had already stopped ringing. That was the first sign something was wrong. Cecilia Hartley sat at the front pew, her white gloves folded tightly in her lap, and counted the seconds by the sound of whispers behind her. 300 guests, 300 pairs of eyes, and one empty space beside the altar where a groom was supposed to stand. He's simply delayed, her aunt had said an hour ago, her voice too bright to be believed. No one said it now. The vicar had stopped pretending to check his pocket watch. The choir had gone silent after the second hymn, unsure whether to begin a third. And still, Cecilia sat there in her wedding gown, spine straight, chin lifted, because her mother had taught her that a Hartley does not fall apart in public, even when the public is watching her do exactly that. She did not look at her father. She had tried twice, and both times he had looked away first. That was the part that frightened her more than the empty aisle. Her father was not a man who avoided her eyes, not until today. Behind her, the whispers grew bolder, no longer bothering to lower themselves. Perhaps she said something to frighten him off. Poor girl, poor family, more like. I heard the Hartleys hadn't a shilling to their name before this match. Cecilia's hands did not shake. She would not give them that. By the time the great clock over the church door struck the 4th hour, half the guests had already slipped out through the side doors, murmuring apologies that weren't really apologies at all. Chairs scraped. Fans snapped shut. A groom does not arrive 4 hours late unless he does not intend to arrive at all. Everyone in that church understood this, even the one still pretending not to. Her father finally rose. He did not come to her. He walked to the vicar instead and spoke to him in a voice too low for her to hear, and Cecilia understood in that moment that whatever had happened, her father already knew more than he was saying. He had known before she did. The thought settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, slow, cold, spreading outward until it reached every part of her. And then the doors opened again. Not the side doors, where the guests had been slipping away like rats from a sinking ship. The great front doors, the ones reserved for a bride's entrance or a king's. The remaining guests turned. The whispers stopped entirely this time. A man Cecilia had never been introduced to stood in the doorway, tall and unhurried, dressed for a funeral no one had told him about. He did not look at the empty altar. He did not look at her father, still frozen mid-sentence beside the vicar. He looked directly at her. And he began to walk down the aisle her groom had never crossed. 3 weeks earlier, Cecilia had stood in this same church, choosing ribbons for the pews, and had felt nothing that could be called joy. It was not that she disliked Mr. Edmund Price. She barely knew him well enough to dislike him. He was polite in the way strangers are polite of pleasant words that never quite reached his eyes. They had been introduced at a dinner in the spring, engaged by autumn, and in the 6 months between he had called on her exactly 9 times. She had counted. Her mother had called it a fortunate match. Her father had called it a necessary one, and never in front of her, only in the low voice he used for the study door left half open. Cecilia was 17 when she first understood that her family's fortune existed mostly on paper. She was 20 when she understood the paper was worth almost nothing at all. The house in the country had been sold 2 years ago, quietly, dressed up as simplifying the estate. The servants had gone from 12 to 4, and her father, once a man who laughed easily, had become a man who flinched at the sound of the post arriving. So when Mr. Price's father, a tradesman who had built a shipping fortune large enough to buy his son a place among gentlemen, if not quite their respect, proposed the match, no one in the Hartley household called it a romance. They called it a solution. Cecilia had agreed, not happily but willingly. She told herself that willingness was its own kind of dignity. It was only the night before the wedding that something shifted. She had gone downstairs near midnight for a glass of water and found her father awake in his study, a letter open on the desk before him, his face the color of old candle wax. He folded it the moment he saw her. "Nothing," he said before she had asked. "Go to bed, Cecilia." She had not pressed him. A Hartley did not press. But she noticed later that the fire in the grate had burned unusually high that night, as though something had been fed to it that needed to disappear quickly. She thought of it again the next morning, only briefly, while her maid pinned the last of the orange blossoms into her hair. She thought, "That is strange." And then she thought nothing more of it, because brides on their wedding morning are permitted only one kind of thought, and hers was supposed to be happiness, or at least its convincing imitation. She had not known, then, that Mr. Price had received a letter of his own that same night, delivered by a writer who did not wait for a reply, read alone in his rooms, and never spoken of to anyone. She would not know it for some time yet. All she knew, sitting in her father's carriage on the way to the church, was that her father had not met her eyes once that morning, not when he helped her from the carriage, not when he kissed her cheek at the church doors. She had thought it was sentiment. She would soon learn it was guilt. The stranger reached the front pew before anyone thought to stop him. Up close, he was younger than Cecilia had first guessed, not much older than herself, perhaps, but there was a stillness to him that made him seem older, the kind of stillness that came from a man used to being obeyed without raising his voice. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, and his voice carried easily through the hushed church, though he did not seem to be trying to project it. "I am the Duke of Ashworth." A ripple went through what remained of the guests. Even her aunt, who had not stopped fanning herself for the better part of an hour, went suddenly, completely still. Cecilia rose because it seemed the only proper thing to do, though her legs did not entirely feel like her own. "Your Grace, I confess I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't." He did not elaborate. His eyes moved once briefly toward her father, who had gone pale near the altar steps. Something passed between the two men, not a greeting, something closer to recognition. "I had business that could not wait, Miss Hartley. I'm afraid it concerns your groom." The word concerns landed like a struck bell. "Do you know where he is?" The question left her before she could soften it into something more dignified. The Duke did not answer at once. He glanced again toward her father, and this time her father looked away first, the second time that day, and somehow it cut deeper than the first. "Sir Hartley," the Duke said quietly, "perhaps this conversation is better suited to a private room." "There is nothing to discuss," her father said too quickly. "The boy is late, that is all this is." "Papa," Cecilia's voice came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that a few of the remaining guests near the back pretended very hard to be adjusting their gloves. "He is 4 hours late to his own wedding, and you have not once asked why. You have not sent a man to his house. You have not written a single note of inquiry. You have simply sat there." Her father's jaw worked, but no words came. "Because he already knows," the Duke said. The church, what little remained of it, went utterly silent. Cecilia turned to him. "Knows what?" The Duke's eyes held hers, steady, careful, the look of a man choosing which door to open first, knowing that once opened it could not be closed again. "That is not a conversation for this room," he said. "But I did not come here to let you learn it from the whispers of your guests, Miss Hartley. You've had quite enough of those today." Behind her, someone, she did not turn to see who, murmured something about asterisk scandal and ruin asterisk. And for the first time all morning, Cecilia felt something other than humiliation rise up beneath her ribs. She felt anger, and beneath the anger something sharper still, the growing certainty that everyone in this church, save herself, already knew exactly what had happened to her wedding. She looked at her father one last time. "Tell me," she said, "now, or I will hear it from a stranger before I hear it from you, and you will have earned that, Papa." Her father closed his eyes. And for the first time that day, he did not look away. Her father did not speak again in the church. Instead, he asked, in a voice worn thin with something that might have been shame, that they continue this in the vestry, away from the guests who had lingered far longer than politeness required, hungry for whatever came next. The Duke offered his arm to Cecilia as though it were the most natural gesture in the world. She did not take it. "I can walk, Your Grace," she said. "I have managed it all my life without assistance." Something flickered across his face, not offense, she thought, closer to respect. The vestry was small and cold, lit by a single window that let in a gray, indifferent light. Her father shut the door behind them. Her aunt, who had tried to follow, was left outside with a look of profound disappointment, as though she had been denied admission to a play at its final act. "Now," Cecilia said, once the door had clicked shut, "I would like the truth, all of it, beginning with why my father cannot look at me, and ending with why a duke I have never met walked through those doors as though he had been expecting this exact disaster." Her father sank into the single chair the room offered, looking, for the first time in her memory, old. "Edmund Price is not coming," he said. "He will not be coming today, or I suspect any day." "I had gathered that much from the empty altar, Papa." "There was a letter," he continued, not quite meeting her eyes, "delivered to this house last night. I read it after you had gone to bed." "The one you burned." His head lifted, startled. "You saw the fire." "I saw the fire and thought nothing of it, because you had taught me, my whole life, that a Hartley trusts her family without question. I am beginning to think that was a foolish lesson." The Duke, who had remained near the door, spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Your father is not entirely to blame, Miss Hartley. He did not write the circumstances that led to this morning. He only failed to warn you of them, which is its own kind of failure, but not the one you may be imagining." Cecilia turned on him with more heat than she intended. "And you, Your Grace, what is your part in this? Men do not arrive uninvited to strangers' weddings unless they have some stake in the outcome. What is yours?" He did not flinch from the question, though she had meant it to sting. "I have been aware of certain irregularities in Mr. Price's affairs for some months," he said carefully. "Business matters mostly, debts owed and not repaid, promises made and quietly broken. I did not know until recently that those irregularities would touch you directly." "That is not an answer. That is a very well-dressed avoidance of one." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You're right, it is." "Then answer properly." "I came," he said, "because I did not believe you deserved to learn the truth of your own wedding day second-hand, from men who would enjoy telling it more than they would regret it. That is the whole of my reason, Miss Hartley. I promise you nothing more sinister than that." It was, Cecilia thought, either the most honest thing anyone had said to her all day, or the most carefully constructed lie she had ever heard, and she found, to her own frustration, that she could not tell which. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe from a man whose name I did not know an hour ago," she said. "I have had quite enough of people today who claim to be acting in my interest while telling me nothing at all, my father included." Her father made a small, wounded sound, but did not argue. "Then I will tell you what I know," the Duke said. "If you are prepared to hear it, it will not be pleasant." Cecilia lifted her chin, the same motion she had used to hold herself together through 4 hours of whispers, through an empty altar, through her own father's silence. She was not going to abandon it now, in front of a stranger who watched her with an attention that felt, uncomfortably, like being truly seen for the first time that day. "I have sat alone at my own wedding dinner, Your Grace," she said. "I do not believe there is much left that could unsettle me further." She would learn before the hour was out how wrong she was. The Duke did not sit. He remained standing near the window, where the gray light fell across half his face, leaving the other half in shadow, and Cecilia thought irrationally, Given the circumstances, that he seemed like a man who had rehearsed this moment and still found himself unprepared for it. 6 months ago, he began, Mr. Price's father approached your father with a proposal, not a courtship, a transaction dressed in the clothes of one. I know that much, Cecilia said. I was not so naive as to believe this was a love match, Your Grace. My family needed money. The Prices had it and wanted respectability. I understood the arrangement well enough to agree to it. Then you understood only half of it. The Duke's voice was quiet, but it did not waver. What you were not told, what I do not believe your father fully understood himself, until last night, is that the money offered by the elder Mr. Price was never truly his to give. Cecilia felt the floor of the small room tilt, very slightly beneath her feet. What do you mean, not his to give? Her father made a sound low in his throat, not quite a word, more like the beginning of a confession he could not finish. The Duke continued, gently now, as though he understood the ground he was walking on. The senior Mr. Price built his fortune in shipping, a respectable trade on the surface. But over the past 2 years, he has borrowed heavily against cargo that either arrived damaged or did not arrive at all, insurance claims that grew increasingly difficult to justify. Investors began asking questions he could not answer. I still do not see what this has to do with my wedding. "'Cause the dowry your father was promised," the Duke said. "The very money that was meant to save your family's estate was to come from investors who believed they were funding a new shipping venture. A venture that does not exist. Mr. Price, the elder, used the promise of his son's advantageous marriage, your family's name, your father's old connections, as collateral to secure funds he had no intention of ever repaying honestly. Your wedding, Miss Hartley, was never simply a match between two families. It was the final piece of proof he needed to convince his investors he was a man of standing, married into respectability, worth trusting with one final, enormous loan." The silence that followed was so complete that Cecilia could hear her own heartbeat. "And the son," she said slowly, "Edmund, did he know?" "I believe he suspected," the Duke said. "I do not believe he had the courage to stop it." "Then where is he?" "Gone," her father said, and it was the first full sentence he had managed since entering the vestry. His voice cracked on the single word. "Both of them, father and son. The letter I received last night, it was from a solicitor in the city, warning me that the investors had discovered the fraud 2 days ago, that the Prices had already begun moving what remained of their fortune out of the country. That if the wedding proceeded, our family's name would be tied publicly to the scandal the moment it broke, as co-conspirators or as fools. Either way, ruined. So you let me sit in that church." Cecilia's voice had gone very still, very quiet, more frightening in its way than if she had shouted. "You let me sit there for 4 hours, humiliated in front of 300 people, rather than tell me the truth the night before." I did not know what else to do. Her father's hands, folded in his lap, were trembling now. "If I had stopped the wedding myself, if I had sent word that morning, Cecilia, everyone would have known immediately that we knew, that we were part of it. I thought, God forgive me, I thought if he simply failed to appear, if it looked as though he had abandoned you out of cowardice or cold feet, there might still be some way to salvage our name. Yours, at least. I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting yourself." The words came out of her before she could soften them, and she did not try to take them back. "You let the whole of London believe I was jilted, abandoned, unwanted, rather than admit the truth, because the truth was more dangerous to you." Her father did not deny it. That, more than anything he might have said, told her everything. Cecilia turned away from both of them, toward the small window, where the gray morning had not improved with the hour. Somewhere beyond that glass, 300 people were already carrying the story of her ruin into every drawing room in the city. Poor Miss Hartley, left at the altar. One wonders what she must have done, and not one of them would ever know the truer, uglier story, that she had been made a shield for her own father's cowardice, and a pawn in a fraud she hadn't even known she was part of. "I would like to be alone," she said, "to the window rather than to either man." "Miss Hartley," the Duke began. "Please." Her voice cracked, finally, on that single word, the first crack in 4 hours of carefully maintained composure. "You have both been very informative. I find I require a moment that does not include either of you." Her father rose as though to go to her, then stopped himself, some remaining fragment of sense telling him that his comfort was the last thing she wanted. The Duke said nothing further, but as he moved toward the door, he paused beside her, not touching her, not presuming that much, and said, quietly, only for her to hear, "For what it is worth, Miss Hartley, the fault in this was never yours. I hope, in time, you'll believe that." He left her alone in the small, cold room, with her wedding gown still on, and the sound of the departing guests' carriages rattling away outside like the closing of a door she could not see. Cecilia did not know how long she stood alone in the vestry after the door closed. Long enough that the gray light through the window shifted from morning to something closer to noon. Long enough that her legs, still trembling faintly from the shock of standing 4 hours in a church, finally gave way beneath her, and she sank into the chair her father had vacated, her wedding gown pooling around her like something already forgotten. She did not cry. She had expected to, had, in fact, braced herself for it the moment the door shut, but the tears did not come. What came instead was a strange, cold clarity, the kind she imagined soldiers must feel after a battle, when the noise finally stops and all that remains is the quiet business of counting what was lost. She had lost a husband she had never particularly wanted. That, she found, she could bear. She had lost her father's trust, or rather, discovered that it had never quite existed in the way she believed, that he had been willing to let her sit in humiliation rather than risk his own exposure. That was harder to bear, and she suspected it would take longer than an afternoon to properly grieve. And she had gained, in the space of a single morning, the unwelcome knowledge that a duke she had never met knew more about her own life than she did. It was this last thought that pulled her, finally, out of the chair. She smoothed her gown with hands that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will and opened the vestry door. The church beyond was nearly empty now. A few servants moved quietly among the pews, gathering the ribbons and flowers that no one would need again, careful not to look at her directly, the particular kindness of people who did not know what to say and had chosen silence instead. Her aunt was gone, presumably to spread the day's events through every parlor in the city before supper. Her father sat alone in the front pew, his head bowed, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. The Duke of Ashworth stood near the great doors, exactly where she had first seen him, as though he had not moved in the hour since, though she suspected, knowing now the sort of man he seemed to be, that he had simply chosen to wait rather than to leave. "You're still here," she said when she reached him. "I did not think it right to leave before you'd had the chance to ask whatever questions remained." His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who had clearly decided, at some point in the last hour, that patience was the only gift he had left to offer her. "And I suspect there are several." "There are." Cecilia folded her hands in front of her, an old habit from childhood lessons in composure, useful now for keeping them from shaking. "You said Edmund suspected the fraud but lacked the courage to stop it. I would like to know where he is now. A man does not simply vanish the morning of his own wedding without someone, somewhere, knowing where he went." The Duke was quiet for a moment, and Cecilia had the distinct impression he was weighing how much of the truth she could bear on top of everything else the day had already given her. "Tell me all of it," she said, before he could decide for her. "I have had quite enough of people deciding what I am strong enough to hear, Your Grace. My father made that mistake already this morning. I would ask you not to repeat it." Something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise, but close to it, as though she had said something he had not expected and rather admired. "Very well." He gestured toward the nearest pew, an unspoken suggestion that this conversation, too, might be easier seated. She did not take the offer, and after a moment, neither did he. They remained standing, facing one another in the empty aisle where a wedding had failed to happen. "Edmund Price left London 2 nights ago," the Duke said. "Not this morning, as your father assumed. 2 nights ago, under cover of darkness, on a private vessel his father had already arranged, one of the few, I suspect, that was not mortgaged 3 times over to men who will never see their money again." 2 nights ago, Cecilia's voice was flat. He knew then, before the letter my father received, before any of us. I believe he had known for some time. Weeks, perhaps longer. I believe the wedding was meant to proceed regardless. His father needed the appearance of the match to secure one final loan, as I explained. And I do not think Edmund possessed the will to defy him, not even to spare you the humiliation of standing at that altar for a man who had already decided to abandon you to save himself. Then why did he not simply marry me and leave after? The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with something that was not quite grief and not quite fury, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Surely that would have served his father's purposes just as well, the appearance of respectability, secured, and then a convenient disappearance once the money was in hand. I suspect that was, in fact, the original plan. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first real sign of anger she had seen him show all day, though it was clear the anger was not directed at her. But 2 nights ago, the investors who had funded the elder Mr. Price's shipping ventures discovered the truth ahead of schedule. A clerk, I understand, grew suspicious of the accounts and brought his concerns to the wrong dinner table. Word reached the Prices faster than anyone anticipated. There was no longer time to wait for a wedding that might grant them another few weeks of credibility. They needed to disappear immediately, before the investors could have them arrested, or worse. So I was not even worth the charade of a wedding night. Cecilia laughed, a small, bitter sound that surprised her with its bitterness. How fortunate for me. "Miss Hartley." "No, truly." She lifted a hand, not quite steady, to stop whatever comfort he was preparing to offer, because she did not think she could bear comfort just yet, not while the anger was still burning clean and useful inside her. "I would rather you finish the account than console me for it. There will be time enough for feeling later. Right now, I would like to understand exactly how thoroughly I have been used." The Duke studied her for a long moment, long enough that she began to feel the particular discomfort of being truly seen, rather than merely looked at. And then he nodded, as though she had passed some private test he had not announced he was administering. "There is one more piece," he said, "and I suspect it is the piece that will trouble you most, though I do not offer it to cause you pain. Only because I promised you the whole truth, and a partial truth is its own kind of lie." "Go on." "Your father was not entirely ignorant of the fraud. Not at first, at least, not the full scope of it, I believe. Not until the letter he received last night confirmed his worst suspicions. But he had questions, months ago, about the source of the dowry money the Prices had promised. Questions he chose not to pursue, because pursuing them honestly might have ended the engagement, and ending the engagement meant losing the only offer standing between his family and complete ruin." Cecilia felt something cold settle in her chest, displacing even the anger for a moment. "You are telling me my father suspected fraud and married me to it anyway." "I am telling you your father was a desperate man facing choices no father should have to make. And I do not believe he is a villain in this story, Miss Hartley. Only a man who chose the easier silence over the harder truth, as men frequently do when the alternative is watching everything they've built collapse. I do not say this to excuse him. I say it because I suspect that somewhere beneath your anger, you already understand it, and understanding it may, in time, make it easier to forgive, though I would not ask you to forgive it today." Cecilia turned away from him, toward the empty altar where she had been meant to make her vows that morning, and found she could not look at it directly. The flowers were already beginning to wilt in the heat of the closed church, their sweetness turning faintly sour, and she thought that was, perhaps, the truest image of the entire day, something that had looked beautiful from a distance, rotting quietly the moment anyone came close enough to smell it properly. "Why did you come today?" she asked, without turning around. "You still have not answered that question properly, Your Grace, and I find I am no longer in the mood to accept careful evasions dressed as chivalry." Behind her, she heard him take a slow breath, as though preparing to say something he had been avoiding all morning. "That," he said, "is a longer story than the one I've just told you, and I do not think you have the strength today to hear it properly, nor do I think I have yet earned the right to tell it." Cecilia turned to face him at last, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her spine straight despite everything the day had taken from her. "Then you will tell me soon," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes," the Duke said quietly, "soon." The church had begun to grow cold by the time Cecilia's father finally rose from the front pew and approached the two of them, moving with the careful, uncertain steps of a man uncertain of his welcome in his own family's affairs. He did not speak until he stood close enough that his voice would not carry to the servants still moving quietly among the pews. "Cecilia," he said, "we cannot remain here. The story will already be halfway across London by supper. We should return home before." "Before what, Papa?" Cecilia did not turn to look at him. "Before I embarrass you further. I believe that ship has already sailed. Rather elegantly, in fact, from what His Grace tells me 2 nights ago, under cover of darkness, much like the one I very nearly boarded myself, only without my knowledge or consent." Her father flinched at the bitterness in her voice, but he did not argue with it. There was nothing left to argue. The truth had already been laid bare in the vestry, and no amount of careful phrasing would put it away again. "I only meant," he said more quietly now, "that whatever else must be discussed, it need not be discussed in a church that half of London has already walked past today, wondering what fresh scandal it might overhear." It was, Cecilia thought, the first sensible thing her father had said all morning, and she resented him faintly for being right. The carriage ride back to the Hartley townhouse was made in near total silence. Cecilia sat with her hands folded in her lap, still in her wedding gown, watching London slide past the window, ordinary London, unconcerned London, tradesmen calling their wares and children chasing hoops down the pavement, entirely indifferent to the fact that her life had quietly ended and begun again within the space of a single morning. The Duke had offered to see them home in his own carriage, an offer her father had accepted with an eagerness that suggested he did not entirely trust himself to manage the short journey alone with his daughter's silence. Cecilia had not objected. She told herself it was practicality, a faster carriage, fewer questions from curious onlookers who might recognize her family's own, but some smaller, more honest part of her suspected she simply did not want the Duke of Ashworth to leave just yet. Not until he had answered the question she had asked him in the church, and not yet received. They arrived to find the townhouse already in a state of hushed chaos. Servants who should have been at the wedding breakfast stood instead in awkward clusters in the hall, uncertain whether to continue preparing a feast that would now go uneaten, or to quietly begin dismantling it before the neighbors noticed. Cecilia's aunt had apparently already come and gone, leaving behind only a note expressing her deepest sympathies and her firm intention to be unavailable for calls for the next several days. A coward's retreat, dressed in the language of delicacy. Cecilia asked that the wedding breakfast be sent instead to the servants' hall, where at least it would not go entirely to waste, and requested that she be allowed a few minutes to change out of her gown before continuing any further conversation. No one argued with her. She suspected no one quite knew how to argue with a bride who had just been abandoned at the altar, and was now calmly rearranging the day's ruined logistics as though it were any other Tuesday. When she came down again, dressed in a plain gray morning gown that felt, after the weight and spectacle of the wedding dress, almost like relief, she found her father and the Duke waiting for her in the small drawing room at the back of the house. The room reserved for family, not for guests, which struck her as an odd choice until she realized her father likely could not bear to sit in the formal parlor, still decorated with the flowers meant for a wedding celebration that would never take place. "You said you would tell me soon," Cecilia said, taking the chair across from the Duke without waiting to be invited to sit. "I would consider this soon enough, Your Grace. My father may stay or go as he wishes, but I would ask that whatever you have to say, you say it plainly. I have had enough of half-answers today to last a lifetime." The Duke glanced once at her father, a silent question should he remain, and her father, to his credit, understood it and rose. "I'll see that tea is brought," he murmured, and left them alone, which Cecilia recognized as both a kindness and a small act of cowardice, her father once again choosing absence over the discomfort of a difficult conversation. She found she could forgive him for it, faintly, in a way she had not been able to forgive him in the church. Perhaps grief simply wore a person down until forgiveness became easier than the alternative. "Well, Your Grace," she said once the door had clicked shut, "we are alone. You have run out of reasons to delay." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his hands loosely clasped in his lap, his eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, not avoiding her gaze precisely, but gathering himself, the way a man does before stepping into water whose depth he has not yet measured. "I met you once before today," he said finally. "You will not remember it. There is no reason you should." Cecilia frowned. "I think I would remember meeting a duke, Your Grace." "You did not know I was a duke at the time. I was not yet one." A faint, rueful smile touched his mouth, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "My father was still living. I was simply Lord Ashworth then, a younger son's title, of little consequence to anyone, least of all to a room full of guests far more interested in the debutante everyone had come to see. I still don't understand." "It was 4 years ago," he continued, before she could press further. "A ball at Lady Renfield's townhouse. You would have been, what, 17? Newly out. I remember because it was the first season I had attended in years, having spent most of my adult life at my father's estate in the north rather than in London drawing rooms, and I found the whole business rather exhausting. Too much noise, too much performance, too many mothers calculating a young man's worth in the time it took him to cross a room." Cecilia said nothing, though something in her chest had gone very still, trying to reach back through 4 years of seasons and balls and half-remembered faces to find the thread he was describing. "I remember standing near the refreshment table, thoroughly bored, when I noticed a young woman, sitting alone near the edge of the room, not dancing, though the room was full of young men who might easily have asked. I assumed, at first, that she simply had no partner. It was only when I watched a young man approach her, and watched her refuse him with what struck me as genuine, unforced kindness. Not the practiced coyness of a girl playing hard to win, but real consideration, real care for his feelings even in refusal, that I understood she had simply chosen not to dance that evening, for reasons entirely her own, and did not feel the need to explain them to anyone. I remember that night," Cecilia said slowly, the memory surfacing now, thin and half-formed. "My mother had died that spring. I had only just come out of mourning enough to attend it all, and I did not particularly want to be there. I did not want to dance with anyone. I only wanted the evening to end." "I did not know that at the time," the Duke said. "I only knew that I had watched a young woman decline 4 separate invitations to dance over the course of an hour, with unfailing grace toward every man she refused, and I found myself, for reasons I could not entirely explain even to myself, unwilling to stop watching her do it." Cecilia felt heat rise in her cheeks, an entirely unwelcome sensation given everything else the day had already asked of her. "You watched me for an hour and never once introduced yourself." "I very nearly did," the Duke admitted. "I had, in fact, crossed half the room with exactly that intention before my father's steward found me and informed me that my father had collapsed at our townhouse not 20 minutes prior. I left that same night for the north and did not return to London for the better part of a year." By the time I did, you had already gone from your first season into your second, and I told myself the moment had passed, that a man does not reintroduce himself to a young woman on the strength of a single evening's observation, however much that evening had lodged itself somewhere he had not expected it to. And yet, Cecilia said quietly, here you are. Here I am. The Duke's expression grew more serious now, the faint warmth of the memory giving way to something heavier. I heard of your engagement to Mr. Price some months ago. Society is not so large that such news does not eventually reach every corner of it, whether one wishes it to or not. I confess, I felt an unreasonable disappointment upon hearing it, given that I had no claim whatsoever to any feeling about your marriage, having never so much as spoken a word to you in 4 years. I told myself it was none of my concern, and I very nearly succeeded in believing it. What changed? A friend of mine, a man who moves in trade circles I do not usually frequent, mentioned, in passing, some concerns about the elder Mr. Price's shipping investments. Nothing definitive. Rumors mostly, the kind that circulate through counting houses and rarely amount to anything. But your name was attached to those rumors, Miss Hartley, as the intended bride whose family connections were being used to secure further credit, and I found that I could not simply set the information aside as I might have set aside gossip concerning a stranger. So you investigated. I did, quietly over several months through men I trust to be discreet. What I found confirmed the worst of what I had feared, that the marriage being arranged for you was not the honest match it appeared to be, but a piece of scaffolding holding up a fraud that was already beginning to collapse under its own weight. I debated, for longer than I am proud to admit, whether it was my place to intervene at all. We had never been introduced. I had no standing to appear at your father's door and announce that his daughter's fiancé was likely a criminal, on the strength of rumors and a single memory of a ball 4 years past. And yet you came to the church. I came to the church, the Duke agreed, because 2 nights ago, when word reached me that the Prices had fled London entirely, I understood that whatever chance I had once imagined I might have to quietly warn your family before the wedding had already passed. There was no more time for careful, proper introductions. There was only the choice between letting you stand at that altar in complete ignorance, waiting for a man who was never going to arrive, or coming myself to make certain you were not left entirely alone to face it. The room had grown very quiet. Somewhere beyond the drawing-room door, Cecilia could hear the faint clatter of tea things being arranged, the ordinary sounds of a household continuing on despite everything, and she found the contrast between that ordinary sound and the extraordinary conversation taking place within the room almost unbearable. You have known who I was for months, she said slowly, working through the shape of it. You have watched my engagement, investigated my fiancé's family, and said nothing to me at all, until the very morning it all fell apart around me. Yes. Why? The question came out sharper than she intended, though she was no longer entirely certain what emotion sharpened it, anger, perhaps, or something closer to a bewildered, unwilling gratitude that she did not yet know what to do with. If you knew months ago, why did you not simply call on my father directly, quietly, and warn him then? Why let it come to this, to a church full of witnesses, to 4 hours of humiliation, to a scandal that will follow me for the rest of my life regardless of how it ends? The Duke's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had met him that morning, he looked genuinely uncertain. A man confronted with a question he had clearly asked himself many times already, without ever quite settling on an answer that satisfied him. I asked myself that same question a dozen times over the past several months, he said. The truth, Miss Hartley, as unflattering as it is that the evidence I had gathered was never quite conclusive enough to justify the accusation. Rumors of debt are not proof of fraud. Men in trade fail honestly far more often than they fail dishonestly, and I had no wish to destroy a family's reputation, and a young woman's engagement, on the strength of suspicion alone, particularly not when that young woman had never asked for my involvement in her affairs to begin with, and had every right to resent a stranger appearing at her father's door with unproven accusations about the man she was to marry. So you waited. I waited, hoping I was wrong. I continued gathering what proof I could, through channels that moved more slowly than I would have liked, and I told myself that if the marriage proceeded without incident, I would simply have been mistaken, and no harm would have come of my silence. It was only 2 nights ago, when the prices fled and the fraud became undeniable, that I understood waiting was no longer an option. And by then, Miss Hartley, there was no longer time to prevent the humiliation. There was only time to make certain you did not face the worst of it entirely alone, and to be the one to tell you the truth myself, rather than let you learn it in fragments from people who would enjoy your suffering more than they regretted it. Cecilia sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, testing it for the falseness she had grown so accustomed to expecting from every person in her life that day. She found, to her own surprise, that she could not locate any. "That is either the most honest account of cowardice I have ever heard," she said finally, "or the most elaborate excuse for it. I confess I still cannot decide which, Your Grace." "Perhaps it is both," the Duke said quietly. "I do not ask you to admire the waiting, Miss Hartley, only to believe that when the moment finally came that waiting was no longer possible, I did not hesitate to act." The drawing-room door opened before Cecilia could answer, and a maid entered with the tea things, filling the silence with the small, ordinary business of cups and saucers, giving both of them a moment to retreat from the rawness of what had just passed between them. Cecilia watched the Duke of Ashworth accept his cup with perfectly correct manners, as though he had not, moments before, confessed to watching her from across a ballroom for the better part of an hour 4 years ago, and carrying that memory quietly ever since, and she found herself wondering, with a confusion that had nothing at all to do with fraud or debt or her father's cowardice, what precisely she was meant to do with a truth like that, delivered on the very day her whole life had come apart. "I still do not know what to make of you, Your Grace," she said finally, once the maid had gone. "No," the Duke agreed, with the faintest, most unexpected trace of humor in his voice, the first lightness either of them had allowed themselves all day. "I imagine you don't. I am not entirely certain what to make of myself, if I am honest with you, Miss Hartley. This is not, as a rule, how I make the acquaintance of young ladies." Despite everything, despite the ruined wedding, her father's cowardice, the scandal already spreading through every drawing-room in London, Cecilia felt the smallest, most unwilling curve of a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. It did not last. There was still too much wreckage to sort through, too much anger still simmering beneath the surface of her composure, too many questions about her father's role in all of it left unanswered. But it was there, briefly, proof that whatever else this impossible day had taken from her, it had not managed to take everything. The days that followed the wedding that never was settled over the Hartley household, like a fog that refused to lift. Cecilia had expected, in the first raw hours after returning from the church, that grief would arrive quickly and violently, the way a storm arrives, sudden, overwhelming, and then, eventually, spent. Instead, it came slowly in pieces, arriving at odd hours and in odd forms. She would be sitting quietly with her needlework, perfectly composed, and then find herself struck, without warning, by the memory of sitting in that church for 4 hours while 300 people watched her humiliation unfold, and the composure would crack just slightly before she forced it back into place. Worse than the grief, though worse even than the scandal, which arrived exactly as swiftly as she had feared, in the form of fewer callers each day, and those who did call arriving with the particular, hungry sympathy of people who wanted the details of her ruin recounted to them in full. Worse than all of it was the quiet, corrosive question of who, precisely, she was meant to trust now. Her father had not left the house in 3 days. He took his meals alone in his study, and when Cecilia did see him, he looked at her with an expression she had never before associated with her father's face. Something close to fear, as though he expected her, at any moment, to finally say aloud all the things she had every right to say, and had so far, out of some combination of exhaustion and lingering filial habit, held back. She was not ready to forgive him. She was not certain she was ready to speak to him at all, beyond the bare civilities required to share a household. But beneath the anger, in the quiet hours of the night when sleep would not come, she found herself turning over the Duke's words in the drawing room, a desperate man facing choices no father should have to make asterisk, and hating, faintly, that some small, unwilling part of her understood it. It was the Duke himself, though, who occupied the greater portion of her waking thoughts, and this troubled her more than her father's cowardice ever could. He had called twice since the wedding, properly, correctly, with his cards sent up in advance and never staying longer than the strict boundaries of politeness allowed. And both times, Cecilia had found herself watching him with a wariness that surprised her in its intensity. It was not that she disbelieved his account. She had turned the story over 100 times since that afternoon in the drawing room and could find no obvious falseness in it. It was, rather, that she had spent the whole of her adult life being managed by people who claimed to act in her interest while making decisions entirely without her knowledge or consent. Her father chief among them. But not. She was beginning to understand, alone in that particular failing. And she found she could no longer easily distinguish between a man who genuinely wished her well and a man who simply preferred the comfortable fiction of believing so. While quietly deciding her fate from a position she was never permitted to see. The Duke had known about the fraud for months. He had said as much himself, without flinching from the admission. He had watched and investigated and waited, and while she believed his reasons, while she even in her more generous moments understood them, she could not entirely shake the growing, uncomfortable recognition that this was, in its own way, simply another version of the same silence that had already cost her so dearly. Her father had known things and said nothing. The Duke had known things and said nothing. Two different men, two different silences, and yet the result for her had been identical. Standing alone in a church, humiliated before the whole of London, while the men around her weighed and calculated and decided, entirely without her, what she was capable of bearing and when. It was this thought, more than any other, that hardened something in her by the third day. He called again on the fourth afternoon, and this time Cecilia received him alone in the small drawing room, having asked the maid to bring tea and then, more pointedly, to leave the door open. A small, deliberate insistence on propriety that she suspected he noticed, though he said nothing of it. "You look tired, Miss Hartley," he said, once he had taken his seat, and there was genuine concern in his voice, the kind that might once have moved her. "I have had a difficult week, Your Grace. I imagine that is not entirely surprising to you." "No," he agreed quietly, "it is not. I only wished I could have done more to ease it." "That is precisely what I wish to speak with you about." Cecilia set down her teacup with more precision than the gesture strictly required, a small act of control in a week that had offered her very little of it. "I have had a great deal of time to think, these past days, about everything you told me in this room, about the ball 4 years ago, about the months you spent investigating the prices while saying nothing to me or my father, about the careful, considered reasons you have given for each and every silence. I sense you have arrived somewhere I am not going to enjoy hearing," the Duke said, with the faint, wary stillness of a man bracing for a blow he cannot yet see clearly. "I have arrived at the understanding, Your Grace, that you are not so very different from my father, whatever the differences in your intentions." Cecilia kept her voice level, though it cost her something to do so. "You knew, for months, that the man I was to marry was very likely a fraud. You knew there was a real possibility that my wedding day would end in exactly the humiliation it ended in. And you chose, again and again, to wait to gather more proof, to be more certain, to avoid the risk of accusing a man wrongly. And in doing so, you left me entirely ignorant of a danger that concerned no one so much as it concerned me. I have already told you I regret the waiting. I do not doubt that you regret it now after the fact. Once regret costs you nothing. The words came out sharper than she had planned, though she found she did not particularly wish to take them back. But regret after the fact is a luxury, your grace, afforded only to those who were never the ones standing at that altar. You made a series of careful, reasonable, defensible decisions about my life, over the course of several months, without once considering that perhaps the decision was not entirely yours to make. That perhaps, had I known even a fraction of what you knew, I might have found some way to protect myself, rather than simply being protected, after the fact, by a stranger who had appointed himself my guardian without my knowledge or consent. The Duke was silent for a long moment, and Cecilia watched something complicated move across his face. Not quite anger, not quite hurt, something closer to the particular stillness of a man absorbing a truth he had not wanted to hear, but could not entirely dismiss. "You are not wrong," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "I have turned over, many times since that morning, whether I might have come to you directly, months ago, rather than working quietly through channels I believed to be more careful, more certain. I told myself I was protecting you from a false accusation, from scandal that might never have needed to touch you at all if my suspicions had proven wrong. I see now that in doing so, I made precisely the same calculation your father made, that my judgment of what you could bear, and what you needed to know, mattered more than your own right to know it." "Yes," Cecilia said quietly, "that is exactly it." "I cannot undo it," the Duke said. "I wish I could tell you I would act differently, given the chance again, but I am not entirely certain that is true. I am, by nature and by upbringing, a man inclined toward caution, toward certainty before action, and I do not know that 4 years and different circumstances would have changed that inclination as thoroughly as I might wish. What I can tell you, Miss Hartley, is that I understand now, more clearly than I did a week ago, the cost of that caution, and that I am sorry for it, more sincerely than I know how to properly express." It was, Cecilia thought, a more honest answer than she had expected, and it should have moved her more than it did. Instead, she found herself simply tired of careful men and their careful reasons, tired of being managed and protected and decided for by people who genuinely believed themselves to be acting in her interest while never once thinking to ask her what her interest actually was. "I appreciate your honesty, your grace," she said. "I find, however, that I do not have the strength at present to sort through whether your silence was more forgivable than my father's. They both cost me the same afternoon. They both left me the same fool, sitting in that church for 4 hours while everyone around me already knew the truth. I never thought you a fool, Miss Hartley. Perhaps not, but I felt like one, and I suspect that is what matters in the end, rather than what any of you privately believed about my intelligence while withholding from me the one thing that might have spared me the experience entirely." She rose, a clear signal that the visit had reached its end, though she softened it slightly, with something that was not quite warmth but was not entirely its absence either. "I do not say this to be cruel, your grace. I believe, genuinely, that you meant well, in your own careful way. But I find that I cannot, at present, distinguish between a man who protects a woman by making her decisions for her, and a man who simply prefers not to burden her with choices he has already decided, quietly, on her behalf. I have had enough of both this week to last a very long while." The Duke rose as well, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, not with anger, she thought, though perhaps with something that resembled a particular kind of grief, the grief of a man watching a door close that he had only just begun to hope might open. "I understand," he said finally. "I will not call again, Miss Hartley, unless you wish it. I would only ask, not as an argument, only as a hope, that you not judge every silence you encounter for the rest of your life by the measure of this week. Some silences are cowardice. I believe your father's was. but I do not believe every careful man who hesitates before acting is necessarily a coward, however much the outcome this time may have resembled one. Perhaps, Cecilia said. I am not at present in a position to judge the difference fairly. I hope you'll forgive me for that. There is nothing to forgive, the Duke said quietly. You have had a great deal taken from you this week without your consent, Miss Hartley. The very least I can offer you now is the one thing that was never offered to you before, the choice of whether I remain in your life at all. I will abide by whatever you decide. He bowed, correctly, formally, with none of the warmth that had crept into his manner in their earlier conversations, and took his leave. Cecilia stood alone in the small drawing room for a long while after the front door closed behind him, listening to the sound of his carriage pulling away down the street, and told herself, with more conviction than she entirely felt, that she had done the right thing, that a woman who had just learned in the cruelest possible way the cost of trusting men who claimed to know better than she did what she needed, could not afford to make the same mistake twice, however gently, however sincerely. The second offer was made. It did not feel like victory. It felt, if anything, like one more loss added to a week that had already asked far too much of her. But she told herself, standing in that quiet room with the cold tea going untouched on the table, that she would rather be alone by her own choosing than protected, once again, by someone else's. It would be some weeks before she learned how wrong, and how right, that choice would prove to be. 3 weeks passed in the strange, muted quiet of a household, recovering from a scandal it could not openly discuss. Cecilia had begun in that time to rebuild something that resembled a life. She rose each morning, took her breakfast alone or with her father, who had gradually begun venturing out of his study again, and occupied her days with the small, ordinary tasks that had once felt beneath her notice and now felt, strangely, like the only solid ground remaining to her. She had not seen the Duke of Ashworth since the afternoon she had asked him not to call again. He had kept his word. She told herself this was for the best, and most days she nearly believed it. It was on a gray Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the wedding that never was, that the letter arrived. It came not to Cecilia, but to her father, delivered by a writer who did not wait for a reply. The same manner of delivery, Cecilia noted with a cold twist in her stomach, as the letter that had arrived the night before her wedding and changed the whole shape of her life. Her father read it in his study with the door shut, and when he emerged, his face had gone the color of ash. "Papa," Cecilia rose from her needlework the moment she saw him. "What is it?" "Nothing that concerns you," he said, which was precisely the sentence he had used before, and precisely the sentence that had proven last time to be a lie. "Papa," her voice hardened, "I would remind you how that particular assurance served us both 3 weeks ago. I will not be managed again. Tell me what the letter says." Her father sank into the nearest chair, the letter still crumpled in his hand, and for a long moment did not speak. When he finally did, his voice had the flat, exhausted quality of a man who had run out of the strength required to keep secrets. "It is from the solicitor who first warned me of the fraud," he said. "He writes that the elder Mr. Price has been located in France under a false name, attempting to secure new investors for a fresh venture, using entirely fabricated documents. It seems he learned nothing from nearly being caught the first time." "That is troubling," Cecilia said slowly, "but I do not understand why it should frighten you quite so thoroughly. Surely that is a matter for the authorities now, not for us." "It would be," her father said, "were it not for the second matter the solicitor raises." He smoothed the letter with trembling hands, as though the act of flattening the paper might somehow soften what it contained. "It seems Mr. Price, the elder, intends to protect himself from prosecution by claiming that the fraud was a shared enterprise, that your engagement to his son was not merely an unwitting casualty of his schemes, but an active, willing part of them. He intends to claim, Cecilia, that I knew from the beginning precisely what the dowry money represented, and agreed to the marriage regardless, in exchange for a share of the profits. Cecilia felt the floor tilt beneath her for the second time in a month. That is a lie. It is, her father said. But it is a lie that would be very difficult to disprove absolutely, should he present it convincingly enough to the right magistrate, with enough manufactured correspondence to support it. He has already shown himself skilled at manufacturing documents that appear entirely legitimate. I do not know that our word alone would be sufficient to counter it, particularly not now, with the family's reputation already so thoroughly damaged by the scandal of the wedding itself. A ruined family is an easy family to accuse further. No one troubles to defend a name that has already been dragged through enough mud. Cecilia sat very still, turning the shape of this new danger over in her mind. It was, she understood slowly, worse than the humiliation of the empty altar that had cost her pride, and her place in society's good graces, painful but survivable. This threatened something far more permanent. Her father's freedom, the family's name beyond any hope of eventual repair, and her own future reduced to whatever scraps of respectability might remain to a woman whose father stood accused of criminal fraud. "We need proof," she said finally. "Proof that you did not know, or that whatever suspicions you had, you acted on them honestly the moment you understood the truth." I do not know how we would gather such proof, in France, against a man who has already shown himself willing to fabricate whatever evidence suits him. Then we find someone who can. Cecilia rose and found, to her own surprise, that her hands were steady, her voice clear, the particular calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having already survived the worst version of a fear once before, and finding oneself, against all expectation, still standing. Someone with the resources to investigate a man hiding under a false name in a foreign country. Someone with connections among the very investors Mr. Price is currently attempting to deceive, who might be persuaded to help expose him before he can do further damage to us, or to anyone else foolish enough to trust him. Her father looked up at her, understanding dawning slowly across his tired face. "Cecilia." "I know precisely who I mean, Papa, and I can see from your expression that you have already guessed it too." She drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the particular discomfort of what she was about to do. "I sent the Duke of Ashworth away 3 weeks ago because I could not, at the time, forgive the silences that had already cost me so much. I still am not certain I have entirely forgiven them. But I find that pride is a luxury I can no longer afford. When the alternative is watching, you dragged into a courtroom on the strength of a lie that only a man like the Duke may have the resources to disprove." She wrote the letter herself that afternoon in her own hand, without her father's assistance or interference. A small but deliberate insistence, after weeks of being managed by men who believed they knew best, that this decision, at least, would be entirely her own. "Your Grace asterisk. I find myself in the position of requesting the very thing I told you 3 weeks ago I did not wish to receive, your assistance. New information has reached my father today that threatens him far more gravely than the scandal we have already survived, and I do not believe we possess, between the two of us, the resources necessary to counter it alone. I would not ask this of you if I saw any other path. If you are willing to hear the particulars, I would be grateful for your call at your earliest convenience. If you are not, I will understand entirely and will not trouble you further. C. Hartley." He arrived within the hour, which told Cecilia something about the letter's effect, though she chose not to examine too closely what that something was. He listened to the full account without interruption. The solicitor's letter, the accusation Price intended to level against her father, the fabricated correspondence that might yet convince a magistrate of a lie neither of them could easily disprove. And when Cecilia finished, his expression had hardened into something she had not yet seen from him. Not the careful, considering stillness of their earlier conversations, but something closer to controlled anger, the look of a man who had decided, finally, that caution had outlived its usefulness. "I have connections among the investors Price is currently attempting to deceive," he said. "I made it my business to know them during the months I spent investigating his previous fraud. If he is attempting to secure new funds under a false identity, using fabricated documents, those same investors will want very badly to know it, both to protect their own money and to see him properly prosecuted for the first fraud, which he has so far managed to escape simply by fleeing the country before the authorities could act. You would help us, Miss Hartley." His voice, when he said her name, carried a weight she had not heard in it before. "I would have helped you 3 weeks ago, had you allowed it, and I understand precisely why you did not. I do not intend to make the same mistake of hesitation twice, not when the cost of hesitation, as you were kind enough to teach me, falls entirely on people who never asked to bear it. Tell me everything you know, and I will leave for the necessary inquiries within the hour." It was not a declaration of love. Cecilia understood that, even as something in her chest loosened slightly at the sound of it. This was simply a man choosing, this time, to act rather than to wait, exactly as she had told him, weeks ago, that she needed him to. But she found, watching him rise and begin immediately making arrangements, sending for his own solicitor, drafting letters to men whose names she did not recognize, but whose urgency she could read plainly in the set of his jaw, that the difference between this Duke and the one who had waited months to warn her of Edmund Price was not a difference of character so much as a difference of lesson learned. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she respected a man who could learn a hard lesson and act on it far more than she could ever have respected a man who required no lesson at all, because he had never made the mistake in the first place. The next several days passed in a blur of activity, entirely unlike the muted grief of the preceding 3 weeks. The Duke moved with a speed and thoroughness that left Cecilia faintly breathless. Letters dispatched to contacts in France, a meeting arranged with the very investors Price was attempting to deceive, careful documentation gathered proving that Sir Hartley had, in fact, raised concerns about the dowry's source months before the wedding, concerns that had been dismissed by Price's own solicitor in written correspondence the Duke had managed to obtain. Cecilia herself insisted on being present for every stage of it, refusing, this time, to be managed or protected from the details of her own family's defense. She sat in on meetings with solicitors. She reviewed documents alongside her father and the Duke, adding her own recollections of conversations and correspondence that helped fill gaps neither man had thought to ask about. It was, she thought, the first time in her entire life that she had been treated not as someone to be shielded from difficulty, but as someone whose knowledge and judgment were genuinely necessary to solving it. And she found she did not intend to relinquish that role again, whatever happened next. On the 5th day, word arrived that Mr. Price the elder had been apprehended in Calais, attempting to board a ship bound for the Americas, arrested on the strength of the very evidence the Duke and his contacts had assembled. The false accusation against her father, unsupported by any credible documentation and directly contradicted by the correspondence the Duke had gathered, collapsed within days of the arrest, dismissed by the magistrate who reviewed it as the desperate fabrication of a man facing prosecution for far graver crimes. Cecilia received the news standing in the same small drawing room where she had once told the Duke she could not distinguish between a man who protected her and a man who simply preferred not to burden her with choices already made on her behalf. She thought, reading the letter confirming her father's complete exoneration, that she finally understood the distinction he had asked her, weeks ago, to consider: the difference between a man whose silence sprang from cowardice and a man whose hesitation, however costly, had ultimately given way to action the moment action was truly needed. She did not yet know what to do with that understanding, but she suspected, watching the Duke's carriage arrive at the door that same afternoon, bearing the full account of the day's events in his own hand rather than trusting it to a servant's delivery, that she would not have very much longer to decide. The Duke arrived at 4 in the afternoon, and Cecilia met him in the small drawing room that had become, over the past weeks, the unlikely stage for nearly every significant conversation of her life since the wedding that never was. He looked, she thought, tired in a way she had not yet seen from him, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 5 days moving at a pace that allowed for very little sleep. But beneath the tiredness there was something else, something lighter, that had not been present in their earlier, more careful conversations. "You've read the letter, then," he said, glancing at the paper still held loosely in her hand. "I have. My father is cleared entirely. The magistrate found no credible evidence to support Mr. Price's accusations, and considerable evidence to contradict them." Cecilia set the letter down carefully on the small table beside her chair, as though it might otherwise disappear, as though the good news of the past hour might prove, like so much else this past month, to be temporary. "I do not know how to properly thank you for what you have done, Your Grace. I am not certain thanks are sufficient to the scale of it. You need not thank me at all." He took the seat across from her, the same seat he had occupied during their very first conversation in this room, though the man sitting in it now seemed, to Cecilia's eye, subtly different from the one who had sat there weeks ago, less careful perhaps, or simply less willing to hide behind carefulness as a substitute for honesty. "I told you when you sent for me that I did not intend to repeat the mistake of hesitation twice. I meant it. Whatever thanks you feel you owe me, I would ask you to set them aside. I did not act these past 5 days out of obligation, or out of some debt I felt I owed you for my earlier silence. I acted because I could not have lived with myself, watching your family face ruin a second time, while possessing the means to prevent it and choosing, again, to wait." Cecilia studied him for a long moment, turning over the shape of the past 5 days, the letters, the meetings, the careful documentation, all of it conducted at a pace that left no room for the caution that had once defined every interaction she'd had with him. "You have changed, these past weeks, or perhaps I have simply seen a different side of you than the one I saw in the church, and afterward. Perhaps both are true." A faint, rueful smile touched his mouth. "I have had a great deal of time, these past 3 weeks, to consider what you said to me, that I was not so different from your father in the end, whatever the differences in our intentions. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with, Miss Hartley. I do not think it was meant to be comfortable. But I have found, since you said it, that I have thought of very little else, and that when the opportunity came to prove you wrong, I found I wanted, very badly, to take it. And so you did." Cecilia felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of wariness she had been carrying since the moment she'd watched him walk down the aisle of an empty church, unable, until this moment, to fully release it. "I confess, Your Grace, that I have spent a great deal of these past weeks uncertain what to make of you. You told me, the last time you sat in that chair, that you would abide by whatever I decided, and that you would not call again unless I wished it. I remember. I sent for you 3 days later out of necessity, because I did not know where else to turn. I would understand entirely if you believed that necessity was the whole of my reason." She drew a slow breath, steadying herself for what she intended to say next, aware that she was choosing, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, to speak a truth before it had been carefully considered from every angle, before it had been weighed and measured for safety. "But I find, now that the necessity has passed and my father is cleared, and there is no longer any practical reason for you to remain in this drawing room at all, I find that I do not particularly want you to leave." The Duke went very still. "I have spent this past month," Cecilia continued, "surrounded by men who believed they knew better than I did what I could bear, what I deserved to know, what decisions were rightly mine to make and which were better made quietly on my behalf by someone wiser or more careful than myself. My father did it out of cowardice. You did it, I believe, out of genuine care, however poorly it served me in the end. And I have discovered, watching you these past 5 days, refused to hesitate a second time, that the difference between those two silences was never really about intention at all. It was about whether a man was capable of learning from the cost of his own caution and choosing, when it mattered most, to act instead. Cecilia. It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and it landed with a weight that surprised her, though she found she did not mind it. I do not offer you certainty. I am, by nature, a careful man, and I do not know that I can promise you I will never hesitate again, never make the wrong calculation about what you can bear or what you need to know. I can only promise you that I have learned, this past month, the cost of choosing silence over honesty, and that I do not intend to make that particular mistake with you again. Not now, and not in whatever years may follow, should you be willing to grant me the chance to prove it. Cecilia rose and crossed the small space between them, and found that her hands, for the first time since the morning of the wedding that never was, were entirely steady. I am not offering you certainty either, Your Grace, she said. I have been made a fool once already this year by men who believed themselves certain of the right course, and I do not think either of us benefits from pretending we know, with any real confidence, how the years ahead will unfold. But I find I would rather take that uncertainty with a man who has proven himself willing to act, and to learn, and to stand in an empty church for a stranger he had watched for a single hour 4 years past, than spend the rest of my life protecting myself so carefully that I never risk trusting anyone at all. Is that a yes, Miss Hartley? There was something almost unsteady in his voice now, the careful composure she had come to expect from him finally, entirely, given way. It is an invitation, Your Grace, to ask me properly, and this time I would ask that you not wait 4 years or 4 months or even 4 days to do it. He laughed then, a real laugh, warm and startled and entirely unlike the careful, measured man she had first met in the doorway of a church 3 months of turmoil ago, and Cecilia found, watching it, that she had never seen him look quite so young or quite so unguarded. He did not kneel, not in a drawing room, not with the memory of one ruined wedding still fresh enough to make such theater feel unwise. But he took her hand, and he asked her, plainly and without a single moment's hesitation, the question he had apparently been carrying since a ballroom 4 years past, and Cecilia, who had spent a lifetime being careful, being managed, being protected by people who never quite thought to ask what she actually wanted, answered him just as plainly and without hesitation of her own. News of the engagement reached London within the week, and this time, Cecilia noted with some satisfaction, the whispers that followed her through drawing rooms were not whispers of pity, but of astonishment, and something that might in time ripen into respect, that Miss Hartley, so thoroughly humiliated in the spring, had emerged by summer engaged to a duke who had, by every account she heard repeated back to her, moved heaven and earth to clear her father's name and see a genuine criminal brought to justice. Her father, for his part, had begun, slowly, to earn back some measure of the trust he had lost that morning in the church, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, steady work of an honest man attempting to become one again, a process Cecilia understood would take considerably longer than a single scandal's resolution to complete, but which she found herself, for the first time in months, willing to allow him the time to accomplish. The wedding took place the following spring, in the same church where the first had failed so completely to occur. Cecilia had considered briefly choosing a different church entirely, some smaller, quieter chapel with no memory attached to it, where she might marry without the weight of that other, unfinished mourning hanging over the proceedings. But in the end, she found she wanted precisely this church, precisely these pews, precisely the altar where she had once sat for 4 humiliating hours, waiting for a man who was never going to arrive. She wanted, she told the Duke when she explained her reasoning, to walk down that same aisle a second time, and know, this time, exactly who was waiting for her at the end of it. The church was full again, fuller, if anything, than it had been the first time, curiosity and genuine goodwill having drawn even more of London society than the original wedding had managed to attract. But this time, when Cecilia entered through the great front doors on her father's arm, there was no empty space at the altar. The Duke of Ashworth stood exactly where a groom ought to stand, watching her walk toward him with an expression that held nothing of the careful, measured stillness she had first mistaken, all those months ago, for coldness. Her father, walking beside her, leaned close as they reached the halfway point of the aisle. "I am sorry," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear it, "for every silence I ever chose over honesty with you, Cecilia. I do not expect it to be forgotten. I only hope in time it might be forgiven." "It already has been, Papa," she said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it entirely. "You are here, walking me toward the one silence in my life that was finally broken in time to matter. I think that is enough." When they reached the altar, her father placed her hand in the Duke's with a steadiness that had been entirely absent from his manner the year before, and stepped back to take his place among the witnesses. No longer a man avoiding his daughter's eyes, but one watching her openly, with something that looked very much like pride. The vows were spoken clearly, without hesitation, by both parties. The Duke's voice did not waver, neither did Cecilia's. Afterward, at the wedding breakfast that followed, held, this time, in a house full of laughter rather than servants quietly dismantling an uneaten feast, Cecilia found a quiet moment to slip away to the edge of the room, watching the celebration unfold around her. Her father, laughing genuinely for the first time in over a year, deep in conversation with the Duke's own steward. Her aunt, thoroughly recovered from her earlier cowardice, holding court over a cluster of admiring guests as though she had never once abandoned her niece to face scandal alone. And at the center of it all, the Duke, making his way steadily back toward her, as he always seemed to in the end. "You've gone quiet," he said, reaching her side. "Regrets on your wedding day?" "None," Cecilia said. "I was only thinking of the last time I sat in that church, in a gown very much like this one, and how certain I was, in that moment, that the empty chair beside me would remain empty forever, that no one was coming, that no one would ever come, and that I would spend the whole of my life being the woman society remembered as poor Miss Hartley, left at the altar. And now—" Cecilia looked around the room, at her father's genuine laughter, at the husband beside her who had learned, at real cost, the difference between careful silence and honest action, at the life spreading out before her that looked nothing at all like the ruin she had once been so certain awaited her, and found that the empty chair of that first terrible morning had been so thoroughly, so completely replaced that she could barely summon the shape of it any more. "Now," she said, slipping her hand into his, "I find I am rather glad the chair was ever empty at all. I do not think I would have learned otherwise precisely who was worth waiting for." The Duke smiled, the real smile, the unguarded one, the one she had come to recognize as belonging only to her, and led her back into the warmth and noise of the celebration, where the chair beside her, for the first time in a very long while, was never empty again. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this Duke story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks super chat. Your support truly helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.